I worked the overnight stock shift at a large grocery store for about 2 years in my mid-20s. It was one of those big box stores, wide aisles, high shelves, fluorescent lights that buzzed just slightly if the building got quiet enough. The kind of place that feels perfectly ordinary at noon and quietly wrong at 3 in the morning. There were usually 4 of us on overnight. We'd come in at 11 after the last customers had been ushered out and the day manager had gone home. A closing supervisor would walk us through, hand over the keys, and leave us to it. Stocking shelves, pulling dates, mopping, inventory. Repetitive work that I actually didn't mind. There's a kind of peace to a large empty building when you know every person in it. Or when you think you do. The store had a layout quirk I'd noticed from my first week. Aisle 9, pet food and household supplies, ran along the far back wall of the building, parallel to the loading dock. Because of the way the stockroom was positioned, the security camera on that aisle had a blind spot, about a 12-foot section in the middle where neither the front nor the back camera could see. The day staff knew about it. The overnight staff knew about it. Management had been saying they'd fix it for months. They never did. My first strange experience happened on a Wednesday night in late winter. I was working alone on the back half of the store while my coworkers handled the front. I'd been running stock for about 2 hours, moving between the stock room and the floor in that comfortable, half-awake rhythm you develop after a while. I was loading soup cans in aisle 8 when I heard something in aisle 9. A soft, dragging sound, low and slow, like something being pulled across the linoleum. I stood still and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was the building settling. Old structures make sounds, and this one had been around long enough to have all kinds of them. I went back to my soup cans. About 20 minutes later, I went around to aisle 9 to pull the next pallet, and I noticed something on the floor in the middle of the aisle, right in the blind spot area. A single men's work boot, just the one, sitting upright in the middle of the aisle like it had been placed there. I stood at the end of the aisle and looked at it for a moment, then I walked over, picked it up, and carried it to the lost and found bin by the customer service desk. I figured a customer had kicked it off, or it had fallen from a shelf, though we didn't sell shoes. I let it go. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. This time, it wasn't a boot. It was a single work glove. Same aisle, same section, middle of the floor, placed upright like a little monument. I mentioned it to my coworker, Renata. She was quiet for a second, then told me she'd found something similar the week before I started, a rolled-up jacket in that same aisle. She thought a stock person had left it. She hadn't brought it up because it seemed too small to bother reporting. We started paying attention. Over the following 2 weeks, we kept a loose mental note of anything unusual in that aisle. The sounds continued, always between 1 and 3 in the morning. The same slow dragging. Once a soft knock from behind the bottom shelf, like something tapping the interior of the wall. I told our overnight supervisor, a methodical man named Dennis. He didn't dismiss it. He walked the aisle with me on a Thursday night, checked the loading dock access on the other side of the wall, checked the stockroom entry. Everything locked. He shrugged and said the building had mouse problems sometimes. He said it without a lot of conviction. What finally ended it for me was on a Friday, about 3 weeks into this. I was alone in the back half of the store again, maybe 2:30 in the morning, and I heard the sound, clearer than usual, not from behind the wall, but from within the aisle itself. I walked around from aisle 8, and I saw, at the far end of aisle 9, a figure turning the corner. Not running, not hurrying, just walking, calm and slow, the way someone walks when they think no one is watching them. The figure disappeared around the end cap before I could process what I was seeing. I stood there for a full 3 seconds doing nothing. Then I walked to where the figure had been and looked around the corner. The main aisle was empty. The front of the store was empty. Every entrance was locked from inside. I called Dennis and told him exactly what I saw. He called the duty manager. They did a full walk of the building. What they found in the far back corner of the stack room, behind a shelving unit that had been slid forward from the wall by a few feet, was a narrow space. Not large, just large enough for a person. Inside that space, an empty water bottle, a folded blanket, and a small battery-powered lantern that had been turned off. Someone had been sheltering in the stockroom, using the building at night, getting in through a loading dock latch that, it turned out, had a broken secondary lock the maintenance team hadn't flagged. The matter was turned over to the appropriate people. I was never told the full outcome. Within the month, the camera in aisle 9 was fixed, the loading dock was properly secured, and a new overnight protocol was put in place. I finished out my contract and didn't renew it. The work itself was fine. The building was fine. It was the thought of all those nights I'd been in there, thinking I knew every person present, that I couldn't shake. 12 feet of blind spot. That's all it takes.
I did private security for a few years in my early 30s, mostly commercial sites, parking structures, office parks, a couple of industrial facilities. The kind of work where 95% of your shift is nothing happening at all, and you learn to be fine with that. The post I want to tell you about was an industrial storage facility on the edge of a small city, the kind of place where the buildings thin out and the lots get wider and darker. The facility stored equipment for several contracting businesses, vehicles, heavy machinery, tools. It was surrounded by a perimeter fence, lit by overhead pole lights that cast pools of white light with significant shadows between them, and accessed through a single gated entrance off the main access road. My job was simple: midnight to 8. Check the gate log, patrol the perimeter every 2 hours, watch the monitors, and document anything unusual. Most nights, there was nothing to document. The log was an old-fashioned paper sign-in system at the gate booth. Every person who entered or exited had to sign in and out with their name, company affiliation, and time. Contractors sometimes came in late, a driver picking up a vehicle, someone collecting equipment for an early morning job. This was normal. I'd radio in, verify their name against the authorized list, let them through. I've been at the post about 3 months when I noticed the first discrepancy. On a Tuesday morning, I was doing my end-of-shift log review, just checking that the entry and exit times matched up, and I found an entry I hadn't made. Someone had signed in at 3:14 a.m. under a contractor name I didn't recognize. The exit column was blank. I stared at that entry for a long time. I had not let anyone through that gate that night. I was certain of it. I sat in that booth from midnight until now, and I had not opened that gate. I brought it up to the daytime supervisor when he arrived. He checked the authorized contractor list. The name in the log wasn't on it. He checked the gate mechanism log, electronic, separate from the paper one, and it showed no entries between my arrival and his. He concluded it was a prank. One of the other guards, he thought, filling in a fake name. He wasn't concerned. I was a little concerned, but not enough to push it. The same thing happened 2 weeks later. Different night, different handwriting, different fake name. Again, no gate mechanism record. Again, an entry I hadn't made. Again, no exit logged. I started paying very close attention. I began arriving 10 minutes before my shift to check the log before anything else, establishing a clean baseline. I started making small private marks on the sign-in pages at the bottom, not visible to anyone else, just so I'd know if a page had been replaced. On the third incident, about 5 weeks after the first, I was watching the perimeter camera feeds when I noticed something on the east side of the facility. The cameras had a 10-second cycle delay, rotating through feeds. In one cycle, the east fence line was clear. In the next, There was a figure standing just outside the fence in the shadow between two pole lights. I leaned toward the monitor. By the next cycle, the figure was gone. I called my supervisor's emergency line and reported it. He told me to do a perimeter check, but to stay in the vehicle and not to confront anyone. I drove the perimeter. The east fence line was clear. The fence itself showed no damage. Back in the booth, I found the log. A new entry, 2:47 a.m., a name I didn't recognize, handwriting I hadn't seen before. I had been outside for 11 minutes. The booth was empty. Someone had come into my booth, signed the log, and left. The investigation that followed was handled by the facility's contracted security company and the local authorities. What they found eventually was that a section of the perimeter fence on the south, not the east where I'd been looking, had been carefully cut and repinned to look intact. The cut section could be lifted and resealed from the outside in under a minute. Who was coming in, what they were looking at or doing inside the facility, how many times it had happened before I noticed, most of that was never fully shared with me. I was told it was an ongoing matter. I was moved to a different post. What I think about now isn't the figure by the fence or the entries in the log. It's the handwriting. It was neat, unhurried, the kind of handwriting you produce when you're completely calm and have all the time in the world. Whoever came into that booth while I was gone wasn't afraid. Not of being caught, not of the cameras, not of me. That's the part that doesn't leave you. I worked the night desk at a small residential motel for almost a year. Not a highway chain, the kind of place that's been locally owned for decades. 40 rooms in a single-story horseshoe shape around a parking lot. An ice machine by the stairwell that nobody used because there were no stairs. It sat on the edge of a mid-sized town, the last building before the road stretched out into farmland. The owner, an older woman named Vera, worked the day shift herself. She'd hand off to me at 10 and be back by 7. In between, it was just me, the desk, the monitors, and the lot. Most of the guests were what you'd expect. Traveling workers, people between apartments, the occasional road tripper. Quiet, mostly. You learn people's patterns fast in a place like that. Which rooms have early risers, which guests come back after midnight, which ones want to be left entirely alone. Room 11 was at the far end of the west arm of the horseshoe, closest to the road and farthest from the desk. It had a reputation among the staff. Nothing dramatic, just that it was harder to rent for some reason. Vera said it was the noise from the road. I took her word for it. In my third month, a long-term guest named Mr. Caswell took room 11. He'd booked for 3 weeks, paid in advance, and was polite in the minimal way that long-term motel guests often are. He'd come in around 8 or 9 in the evening, and that was generally the last I'd see of him until the next day. The first thing I noticed was the light. Room 11's curtains faced the parking lot. Every other room had the standard light gap at the curtain edge, visible from the desk if you looked. For the first 2 weeks, room 11 was dark by 11, consistent, normal. Then one night, around 2 in the morning, I noticed the light was still on in room 11. I didn't think much of it. Guests keep odd hours. But over the following week, I realized something. The light was always on between 2 and 4 in the morning, and consistently off before that and after that, every single night. I also noticed that Mr. Caswell had stopped coming in through the front lot. He'd been checking in with a nod as he passed the desk each evening, reliable. Then, around the same time the light pattern changed, he simply stopped appearing at the front. His keycard was still registering to the room. The Do Not Disturb sign stayed on the door during housekeeping hours, which was his right. But I hadn't seen him in person in 11 days. On a Wednesday night, near 3 in the morning, I did my standard lot walk. Once per shift, all 40 rooms, nothing unusual. When I reached room 11, I stopped. There were sounds from inside. Not the television, not music. Voices, low, two distinct ones, one of which didn't sound like Mr. Caswell. Guests weren't prohibited from having visitors, as long as the visitor didn't stay. But something about the pattern of what I'd been noticing made me pause. I knocked and announced myself as the front desk. The voices stopped immediately. After a moment, Mr. Caswell opened the door just a few inches. He looked different than I remembered him, thinner in the face. He told me everything was fine, that a friend was visiting, and he'd appreciate the privacy. His tone was polite. His eyes were not quite focused on me. I said goodnight and walked back to the desk. I called Vera on her personal line, which she'd told me to use only if something felt genuinely wrong. I told her what I'd observed over the past 2 weeks, the light pattern, the change in his routine, the voices, the way he'd looked at the door. Vera arrived at 4 in the morning. She'd also, before driving over, called someone she knew at the local non-emergency line. Not a formal report, just a mention. A deputy arrived 20 minutes after Vera did. What unfolded from that point wasn't dramatic in the visible sense. There was a conversation at the door of room 11. There was a period of quiet. A second person, who was not a registered guest, left the room and was spoken to at length by the deputy in the parking lot. Mr. Caswell checked out the following morning. Vera never told me exactly what had been happening in that room. She thanked me for calling her and said I'd done the right thing. The deputy, before he left, told me that sometimes the best thing a person in my position could do was notice a pattern and say something, because the details that seem small to one person are sometimes the whole picture to another. I worked the night desk for another 7 months after that. I was good at the job, I think, because I'd learned to pay attention to patterns, to the rhythms of a place, and what it looked like when something broke that rhythm. Room 11 went back to being hard to rent. The road noise, Vera would say when someone would ask. I never corrected her.